walk along these city streets you used to walk around with me. And every step I take reminds you how much you meant to me. Oh, how can I forget you when there is always something that do remind me? Always something that do remind me. I was born to love you, and I will never be free. You'll always be a part of me. Whoa, whoa, whoa. When shadows fall, I pass a small cafe where we would dance at night. And I remember how it felt to kiss and hold you tight. Oh, how can I forget you when there is always something that do remind me? There was always something that do remind me. I was born to love you, and I will never be free. You'll always be a part of me. Whoa, 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 whoa. If you should find you miss the sweet and tender love we used to share, just go back to the places that we used to know, and I'll be there. How can I forget you? And there was always something to remind me. Hi, everybody. I hope that this works, because I'm literally borrowing my neighbor's Wi-Fi because some cable collapsed in front of the place yesterday, and the internet is out and is going to be out for the foreseeable future. So I hope this works. I'm pretty sure it was the deep state. Pretty sure they're trying to stop me from pilling everybody on the year anniversary of January 6th. But that's okay. I can do it on January 7th. I even wore my commemorative Boogaloo Boys shirt to remind us all. Okay, if the audio is fine, that's it. You don't have to look at me. In fact, I kind of recommend you not look at me while you're listening to any of this, because who needs to see this? So yesterday was the year anniversary of the insurrectionary attack on the Capitol. And I remember a year ago, I streamed. I remember saw it happening on my phone while I was getting tacos. And people were like, holy shit. And then I talked about it a little bit, but mostly I talked about the book that we were talking about, the For the Republic for which it stands. And I mostly just said, this is pretty much just funny, and people freaking out about it should settle down. And then I actually got the stream got cut down into chunks by weirdos who have put it upon themselves to hold people accountable for bad takes because it's making Nazism happen or something. And they said, look, this person says that the Cap is just a shrine to corruption, and that there's nothing to be mourned there. And I was correct. And I got to say, a year later, I still feel very correct. I got to say, honestly, the degree to which the insurrectionary energy that everyone was freaked out about kind of just dissipated after Biden was inaugurated surprised me, and I was minimizing it at the time. I was saying this is not the fucking giant deal you guys are acting like it is. But even I assumed that there'd be, and I said it a number of times, some sort of eruption of stochastic violence, some remainder of super dedicated Q people who would take matters into their own hands, and that didn't even happen. We didn't even get that. The closest thing we've gotten to any sort of development of the real cultic edge of Trump diehardery are those guys who are like slow walking Jonestown in Dallas right now. Those people who are just sort of egging themselves into doing a mass suicide. Everybody else went home. Everybody else went home and decided to die of coronavirus to own the liberals. Somebody says 50-50 odds it was a FBI entrapment gone wrong. See, this is where I think you got to think about it through the looking glass. Just like what Tom O'Neill said about the Manson murders being a CIA MK Ultra thing gone wrong. What if it's gone right? You know, not necessarily that there is any specific goal being desired, but just that happening is better for the security state than it not happening. And when you have as many fingers in as many extremist pies as the FBI always does, stopping things from happening isn't really a good percentage, because you're not going to get blamed either way. I mean, 9/11 basically proved that. You're going to get more money no matter what happens. Now, you have to stop some things. Once in a while, you got to stop a thing so you can point to it. But a really big thing like that, stopping it isn't the percentage play. Letting it happen is the percentage. And in the years since, the people who insisted that you take the insurrection seriously have pointed to, as evidence that they were correct, the fact that Q psychos and Trumpists are taking all of these local seats and trying to take over state electoral boards and stuff, so that they can do a legal nullification of votes next time. And I got to tell you, I don't think that has anything to do with a 1-6. That is going to happen independently of that. The spectacular expression, the one that we fixate on, is the least important. It's the most epiphenomenal. The thing that matters is the structural ratchet of the Republican Party using its minoritarian levers of control to nullify the threat of being voted out of office by the fact that they do represent a rump of voters. But that process has been going on unimpeded for 20 years. And if they do steal an election the way people are freaking out, it will not be a coup. It will be Bush v. Gore all over again. And if that wasn't a coup, I'm sorry, I don't know how you can say that this one will be, just because it's Trump instead of a guy who paid his dues because he was a president's son who had been governor of Texas or something, and they all look like normal politicians, so it's okay. I mean, my God, people were talking about how horrifying it was that the Democrats were all shaking Dick Cheney's hand in the House yesterday because of what he did with Iraq and everything. He did a fucking coup! He stole an election! He did the thing that all these people are freaking out about. I think the desire for there to be some kind of coup is the same desire for there to be some sort of climate apocalypse. It's the desire for a rupture of our constraining reality that will somehow free us. We don't know how, because we can't imagine it. Capitalist realism again. But it would be different. It would be fundamentally different. Our lives would be fundamentally different. And even if they were worse in some objective sense, the familiar miseries that we have become locked into would be obviated. And that is what people want. That's what people want out of a coup. That's what people want out of climate change. That's what people want out of COVID. And that's just not likely to happen. If there's going to be a apocalypse, it has to be individual. It has to be internal. You have to do it yourself. You have to push through the veil yourself. You can't wait for them to do it for you. Because there's no incentive in the system to allow that to happen. It's all up to us to decide what is too much and then act accordingly, to change our conditions of consent. But I understand why that's scary and impossible, because we are locked into this. Like the thing that fascinates me about the real doomheads about democracy, like democracy's over, is that all they want to do is make other people feel like them. Not with the idea that it's going to lead to anything. I really don't think they believe that. I think the more clear-eyed ones understand that, well, fuck, I think democracy is ending. I think it's a crisis. And yet all I'm doing is the same thing everybody else is doing, which is doing my job, posting to vent stress, but otherwise waiting for the asteroid to hit. Realistically, logically, that means that even if my communication is effective and I get other people to feel as deeply as I do that we are in a crisis, all you're going to have is another person or another group of people with that emotional energy, but doing the same thing, allowing the thing to happen. And I honestly think more than that, more even than wanting other people to feel as you do, the real motivation is to have a consolation for if it actually happens. And that consolation will be the ability to say, as the lights dim, I told you so. That is really what people who cultivate their anxiety and their Cassandra visions of catastrophe are doing. They, like we all are, feel completely locked into being a scared rabbit, waiting for the end, only able to console ourselves with the minor pleasures that we have become addicted to because it's all we know. But then consoling ourselves with the knowledge that we understand something that the masses don't, and that our enemies don't, and that the people we don't like don't. Which means that if we have even our momentary, fleeting, barely sufficient pleasures taken from us, we will have at least the compensating pleasure of knowing we were right. And that seems, you say, that seems like an absurd thing. But when you consider the degree to which, and I'm talking about myself here, obviously, self-worth, when you feel like you're not in control of your life, when you feel like you are a cog, as we all do, when you feel like the human urge towards self-definition that is denied us at this stage of capitalism and has left us unable to express those animal urges and made us compensate with treats. And when I say treats, I don't mean snacks. I mean the aesthetic compensations of life in the habit trail. And one of the big ones for the overeducated, overproduced elite of this country, which is most college-educated people under 40, I would say, is building a worldview, building an identity around perception of the world around us, and curating it and validating ourselves by cherishing and fixating on the difference between our understanding of the world around us and what we perceive as general understandings of the world. Like, I might be filled with self-loathing because I feel that I am trapped. I might feel like I've been thwarted in any attempt to really define my life by anything other than the terms of capital, like everybody else. But unlike everybody else, I know that why this is happening, or I feel like I know why this is happening, and I know where it's headed. And that is a real thing. That's a genuine element of self-interest, is that sense of self. And this is why I talk a lot about how you can't speak to the self-interests of capitalists as people as being purely their material self-interest. Because nobody's self-interest is simply a material thing. It is filtered through a whole bunch of self-perceptions that are as deeply held and as powerful a source of pleasure as material security, wealth, Epicurean delights are. And so that means that you can feel like you're at the last days of a dying empire. You can feel like even formal democracy is about to be obliterated. You can feel like you have no way to stop it. But you can still feel every day like I can go on in these conditions because I know what they don't. And more importantly, if the day comes, I can tell everyone that I told them so. I guarantee you that if there is a coup, an actual one, like Proud Boys armed by the state in the streets to nullify an election, caravan of death, Chile 73 type stuff, like literal helicopter rides. As long as the internet exists, before it gets like cut off by the government or whatever, and people are still able to post, the vast majority of posts of the people who are the most alarmed about that possibility are not going to be about how to resist it. They're going to say, I fucking told you people. You laughed at me. You fucking irony pill dipshits. Oh, you didn't think this was a big deal, huh? Where are you now? Where do you think now? Before it gets cut off. That'll be the last thing that will be like the cri de coeur. I told you so. Which is what happens when your self-perception is not as an agent of history, not as a being with will and the ability to exert it, but as a passive critic, which is the role that we have all, a lot of us, have instinctively taken, given the paucity of options. But I think the funniest thing is that after all that fretting and shit, the trajectory we're on would be Trump getting reelected without there needing to be any shenanigans. Probably not a popular vote victory, but at this point, who cares? But like basically the same map as 2016. Without anybody falsifying any votes or stopping counting or any of that shit. The cyber ninjas being engaged. Because the Democrats Or shock of shocks, who could have seen this coming? See, here's me being smug about something. Here's me being able to be like, aha, I told you, instead of doing anything about it. The Democrats, incapable of governing in a crisis. Oh man, I got red lights on my streamer thing and everything. Okay, there's a green light. That should be better. Like I said, apologies. This is stolen internet for now. Yeah, it sure is a hell of a thing, huh? It's pretty wacky what's going on. Hell of a thing. Okay, good. The audio's fine, just don't look at me. Don't look at me, max headroom out. I can see the chat. The chat's going, so that's good. Oh, somebody wants me to ask, to speak on the D&D episodes and say if Jack and Pat did a good job. Jack and Pat did a great job. And of course, Chris did an amazing job editing it. I am the least valuable appendage of the show when we do D&D stuff. I am most appreciative for everybody else when we do D&D, because I honestly have never gotten a handle for it. I had more fun this time because I was just a barbarian who didn't have to talk or think too much, but I realized I cannot, as somebody pointed this out to me, and it really nailed me. I'm very bad at chess. I'm like supernaturally bad at chess. I will do moves that are just incomprehensibly bad, that I just literally don't see when I do them. And I realize what it is that I am so agonized by the choice to make a move that I subconsciously steer my pieces into oblivion. I basically am death-driven while I play these games because I don't get any pleasure out of making a decision. I only get anxiety out of it. So I just want it to be over as soon as possible. That's also why I'm not a gamer. Like, I think one of the reasons that I was able to put together this absurd, quote-unquote, career as a personality, even though I don't really have any talent, is that I embody more than, I guess, most, in terms of, like, perfectly embodying the condition of paralyzed self-consciousness. And then that gives me the ability to speak on that condition and to try to articulate how it feels. But that's it. Like, I can't do anything else. I can't make decisions. I can't engage myself. So I do what is left, which is critique. And that's like worth very little except as entertainment. And I'm fortunate that some are entertained by it. See, like the book, for example. Very hard for me to write because as soon as I have something written down, I'm looking at it. And as soon as I'm looking at it, I am being paralyzed by the idea that it's bad and wrong and that it's going to be annihilated. I'm trying, though. We'll see. Like, extemporaneous speaking works because it's gone as I say it. There's no remaining vestige. It's entirely contained in the moment of expression. So there's not the chance, the necessity of going over it and contemplating it and then being gripped by uncertainty about it. But I'm trying. I have some. I think I'm getting. I honestly feel like the project of putting together the next history podcast with Chris has been very good at focusing a lot. And I honestly am starting to wonder if that's going to be the shape it takes. But we'll see. Like the contours of early Protestantism in the age of the printing press, to me, are fascinating because I genuinely believe that we are in a similar period. Like, obviously, history is a cycle, right? It's cyclical. And you see throughout human history these inflection points where one condition is slowly changed over time. It's not stable. It's stable in a broad sense, but changes are accumulating over time that eventually reach an inflection point, a crisis point, and then something else occurs. And all the people who are living in that moment don't know what they're building because by definition they can't. They only have lived lives under certain conditions and can only operate from the assumptions of those conditions. But the crisis that they live amongst is forcing them to make choices that are building new structures that they aren't even able to recognize. And then their children and their children grow up in a literally different world. And I feel like the moment of the Reformation, the early 16th century in Europe, is a similar moment as the one we're living in now, in that a type of human subjectivity is in a technologically and materially imposed crisis. And we are in the process of creating a new human subjectivity. The abstracted internal culturated identity that mass literacy produced is, in my opinion, more than anything, what produced Protestantism. Christianity, faith, which was necessary for life, in the absence of anything else, could no longer be sustained through social practice alone. When you have literacy, reading, and modern urban life. And everyone's brain broke. I mean, if you look at the history of the long crisis from the early 1500s until the late 17th century, you are seeing this polity reformat its mental hard drive and create a new subjectivity. And we are in that process now. And the material driver in both cases is fucking climate change. In the case of early modern Europe, the onset of the Little Ice Age, which fatally undermined, in many cases, literally, the ecological conditions that had allowed sort of post-Black Death feudalism to be resurrected. You had an intense warming period in the post-Black Death generations, and then in the mid 1500s, going into the 1600s, you see this significant drop in temperatures that causes significant damage to agricultural productivity. At the very same time that people are living in their heads in a way they never had before. And I think that is where we are now. That was the final crisis of feudalism interacting with a exogenous shock and then being disrupted. And in that disruption, we created the coping mechanisms, the things that resolve those old contradictions and created new contradictions, which is liberal secular capitalism, exported it around the world. And now, at the end of that process, the industrial technology that we use to do it has destabilized our atmosphere, destabilized our ecology, and once again interfered with the assumed conditions of production that had allowed the previous social organizations to exist at the exact same time that a new human subjectivity is being created by mass computer literacy. Because going from a largely illiterate social culture to a literate, internal, abstracted, cloud-based, like when you're reading about Luther and about the Augsburg Confession or whatever the fuck, and you're reading pamphlets about how the Pope is the Antichrist, you are participating in a imagined social reality, and you are imagining yourself as a synthetic being within that reality that did not exist before literacy, at least not in the intensity, cannot be reproduced and reinscribed through the literal act of sitting and reading the way that it could before. And now we have reached a point where we are like in a fundamental sense living virtually. The same abstraction as literacy, but taken to a more intensified technological level, which is degrees of difference reaching an inflection point. Like, people said the same shit I'm saying about the advent of motion pictures and television. And you had Marshall McLuhan talking about the medium and the message and all that stuff in the glory days of the post-Cold War consensus. And that was a shift. That was an intensification, but it was within a stabilized relationship that was then fatally destabilized by another level. A thing that is taking that process of abstraction and bringing it to an even more intensified level, to the point where inflection is reached. And we're no longer the same people that even our parents were, or our grandparents were. But we're all living at the same time together under conditions created by those previous generations. And that causes significant crisis, cultural crisis, that is exacerbated then by material crisis. And that is why I want to talk about that moment, because it's what we've all been trying to do, and what I've been trying to do with writing and talking about this stuff, is describe this moment as it's happening. But the thing is about that, the limitation of it is that because you're in it, you can't know you can't know where the track is being laid, really. You can imagine, but you are still that previous thing. You are, or at best, a transitional fossil. You are not the thing that's being brought into being. I'm old, man. I grew up without the internet as a little kid. I was not digitally literate. I remember coming in to fucking junior high and seeing those fucking little Macintoshes and elementary school playing Oregon Trail and Carmen Sandiego. I remember the ER of American Online going, booting up. And I remember being able to I remember it taking 10 minutes to download the NFL.com homepage, which for some reason is the first one I tried to look at. I was a football fan as a teenager. And I just went to NFL.com, and I remember sitting at the screen, and watching it slowly fill over the course of 10 minutes, and just thinking, what is the point of this? So I've been warped deeply by my encounter with technology. Like I got dropped into the toxic waste dump like Emil in RoboCop and emerged a different, more monstrous creature. But that experience means that I am not fully of this new reality. And I can't really communicate with those who are, because we have a different vocabulary. We have a different understanding of language. This is Kuhnian incommensurability we're talking about. So while I am fascinated by this moment, I feel like I've kind of reached the point where I can no longer speak too incisively about the specific contrails of this, largely because of how stuck it feels. Now, of course, that feeling of stuckness is only subjective. If there are historians in the near far future, they will see the moment we're in not as a moment of stuckness. They will see it as part of a significant crisis. But most crises are perceived within them at certain points until they aren't, as stasis. And that means that we're not really able to say much about what is to be done. So instead, I'm trying to look backward at another moment where this sort of alchemical transition occurred, and see how that happened, just to give the solace of familiarity, if nothing else. And the thing about this period that I'm really honing in on, more than the Reformation itself, although I find it, obviously fascinating, and like the way that the frontiers of the Reformation were pushed past what Luther wanted in every direction is really interesting to look at. Like materially, you had the peasants of Germany who took what he said to mean, oh yeah, these earthly rulers are not legitimate. If the church that upholds this order is illegitimate, then the temporal power that they express in the name of God is illegitimate. And so you saw the German Peasant War, which of course Luther, a increasingly fat, comfortable monk whose entire life was at the pleasure of rich patrons, the Elector of Saxony specifically, who kept him alive after the diet of worms and kept him in sausages and pumpernickel. Wasn't going to disrupt, so he denied the peasants the validity of their revolt. But they were put down materially. They were put down by force, and that kind of let everybody know the limits of a challenge to authority coming from that. But then you have those who took the theology further, like first the Calvinists, and then the Anabaptists and all of the splinter groups and weirdos who emerged in that moment, trying to figure out how to make sense of a world where socially affirmed religion could no longer be taken for granted, where we are now these abstract Christians with a personal relationship to God, whatever the fuck that means. How do you have a personal relationship to God? How are you not looking in a mirror? And of course, that question is what creates modern neuroses. All modern neuroses spring from that breach. Because you could know God by looking around you, but once that's no longer the case, once you can only know God from looking within, then you can never know God. Because you can only look in the mirror. And that's why eventually the only thing to do is take this neurosis and secularize it so that the answers to it could be found within the market, could be found within our structures of social oppression and exploitation, and not outside of it. Because if it's outside of it, then we might become fatally alienated to the system and attack it. So instead, we abstracted everything into that realm, and it made everything. It made instead of a collective pursuit of the truth, which is what the early Protestants tried to create, just like the early Christians that they were emulating did. You had an individual pursuit, which can only be pursued where? Through the market, through individual competition with others, as a homo economicus, and that's what we've been stuck with. And it is the inability to resolve that crisis that has created a runaway suicide imperative within capitalism. Like, people say capitalism is a death cult, and that is true in the broad sense that we are carrying out a global social project whose encoded aim, not our understanding of it, but the actual programming, is of planetary suicide. But unlike a cult, where everyone within it has some understanding of what is going on and is participating in it, who is saying we are moving towards a goal, we have the opposite situation where everybody is moving towards an individual goal, and because we are doing that, the only collective pursuit we can actually engage in is our annihilation, which is what we're trying to do. But of all this entire era and this entire phenomenon, right now, the thing that I am focusing on and most interested in is the court of Frederick V, the Elector Palatine, in the run-up to the 30 Years' War. Because it, to me, strikes the most harmonic resonances with the moment we're living in. Because you had a situation where religious tensions within the Holy Roman Empire had been cranking up for years. The legitimacy of the courts, of the empire's institutions, its courts, its diets, were being undermined because of this snake in the garden of religious sectorialism. You had Lutheran, you had the Catholic Habsburgs and their Catholic allies. You had the Lutherans, like the Saxons and those who patronized Luther. But then you also had these renegade Calvinists who were not recognized by the Peace of Augsburg of 1555, which had, after a number of wars between the Catholic and Protestant powers of the empire, the Smalkaldic Wars, they basically did what the Roman Empire, the Holy Roman Empire, was designed to do, which is kick the can down the road, if this sounds familiar at all. And to say, we can't resolve this conflict without open violence, so instead we are just going to leave things as they are and come back to it later. And so the Peace of Augsburg recognized the idea that any territorial prince had the right to impose their religion on their area of control. Whose religion was the rule? Basically recognizing the conditions as they had been, that had come out of the Smalkaldic Wars, which were stalemate. The first Smalkaldic War ended in a triumphant Habsburg victory. The second Smalkaldic War, though, saw Charles V get chased out of Vienna. And so they called basically a truce. But that truce only recognized the Lutherans. Because Calvinism, which was more of a threat to centralized authority, more of a threat to traditional authorities, because it decoupled the state from its ability to dictate clergy. Because Luther, who was the most conservative of the Protestants, because he was the first, I believe, in Lutheranism, the relationship between church and state was basically kept as it had been under Catholicism. The only difference was, instead of the Pope exercising authority, on church matters, that authority was transferred to the secular ruler, which is why so many princes, it took a while, but pretty soon after the Luther started talking, a lot of secular princes who wanted more authority, who chafed under the rule of the empire, who wanted and chafed under the rule of the fucking church itself, started adopting Lutheranism, because it said, now we have solved the investiture crisis that had cut through Christendom all during the High Middle Ages by giving the secular prince full authority. And of course they jumped at it. But Calvin, the Calvinists, and of course this is not a coincidence, by the way, that Luther survives as a heretic, which he was, in the bosom of a territorial lord, Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony. And he, of course, then promulgates Lutheranism, which says secular lords should determine ecclesiastical offices, in accordance, of course, with their people. And Calvin, who went to the renegade city-state of Geneva, which is now in Switzerland, but what was at that point had just recently overthrown the rule of the Duke of Savoy and become an independent city, a free city. And we're looking for direction, what to do. Like, we're now sovereign, and now religion is up for grabs. What do we do? And it was there that that Calvin promulgates his notion of a lay ecclesiastic authority. Church separate from the state and controlled by its members, with the state as a guarantor, with the state as made up of members of the church, but as a separate entity. Which, of course, was hot. It's nothing that like the landed princes of Europe wanted to hear, but what was very resonant in the ears of the independent cities of early modern Europe, which chafed under the rule of territorial lords and wanted their own independence. And it's not a coincidence that Calvinism, once he starts writing and the writing starts spreading across Western Europe, resonates in the most urbanized parts of Western Europe. Of course, in Eastern Europe, the only place that takes up Calvinism is rural Transylvania, but that's a different story because of different conditions. But in Western Europe, in France and the Low Countries and the Rhineland, urban areas picked up Calvinism. And so you see the Dutch revolting against Spanish Habsburg rule to enforce their version of a reformed church. The Huguenots of France fight against the Catholics of France and mostly get their asses kicked. But the Huguenots were disproportionately traders and urbanites, and people who lived in their heads, people who lived abstractly. And so by the early 1600s, which is exactly when the Little Ice Age really kicks into gear, when the sun literally dims, the sun goes, somebody turns the dimmer switch on the sun in the early 1600s. At exactly that moment, you have this electoral prince of Germany, which is the highest rank of nobility within the Holy Roman Empire. Because you have obviously just hundreds and hundreds of secular and ecclesiastical princes. You've got individual knights holding small fiefs. The Holy Roman Empire is just this riot of degrees of nobility. But at the very top of that are these 7 electors who elect collectively the Holy Roman Emperor. 3 of them were ecclesiastical rulers, the archbishops of Cologne, Mainz, and is it Trier? I can't remember the other one. And then you've got the electors of Brandenburg, Saxony, and the Palatinate. The Palatinate, which is the Rhineland north of Bavaria, or northwest of Bavaria. And as I said, the Augsburg Treaty recognized de facto Catholicism and Lutheranism, but Calvinism was still technically heresy. And in Heidelberg, Frederick the Elector Palatine, with his trusted buddy Christian of Anhalt, and his I got his last name. I got to look it up to get his last name right because it's very funny. I think he might have made it up. A lot of those guys did that. Abraham. Abraham Skultetus, the top Calvinist theologian of the Palatinate, they set about creating in Heidelberg a successor to Geneva as the capital of Reformed Christianity in Europe. And they spent the run-up to the 30 Years' War while the Bohemian estates were revolting against the imposition of Catholicism in Bohemia. They're building this narrative to themselves that Frederick V, who was a himbo, basically, but who had a very strategic marriage to the daughter of the King of England, James I, they imagine, thanks in part to having read anonymous tracts from a group called the Rosicrucians about a secret group of godly men who were bringing about the apocalypse, thanks in part to reading those guys, and of course reading the Bible through the lens of their own self-interest, decide that Frederick V is the prophesized monarch who will overthrow the devil on earth and bring about the end of the world. And due to that belief, they did a thing that no other prince in Europe would have tried because of how dangerous it would have been, which is accept the renegade Bohemians' offer of the crown of the kingdom of Bohemia in the face of the literally just elected Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II. And that started 30 years of warshed that destroyed Germany in large chunks. And to me, this is a recognizable social and political phenomenon. And so if we can look at what that leads, we can, I don't know, at least be entertained. I can't make too many claims. But anyway, I think it's very interesting. So that's what I've been working on. And maybe I'll put some of it down in paper, hopefully. But the most interesting thing to me about this progression I said that goes from Lutheranism, right? Ecclesiastical lords appointed by earthly princes, basically keeping the social structure as it is, with its society of orders, with its exploitation, with its still, feudalism is in crisis here and it's decomposing, but it would be recognized as a continuity. So let's call it feudalism. And then you had Calvinism, which takes root in the cities, where capitalism is not yet existent, but we are in this fluid state. Capitalism is being built in bits and pieces, largely in the I believe, along with Elaine Wood and Brenner, that largely being created in rural England, but also obviously in the Dutch Low Countries, in the Rhine, the commercial centers of the Rhineland. I mean, Augsburg is also, it's where you had the peace of, it's where the peace was signed in 1555, and that's where the Lutheran Confession was promulgated, and it's also where the Fugger family lent all the money to the Habsburgs that kept the whole thing going. In these areas, Calvinism and its notion of an individualized Christianity, a personal relationship with God that is not socially reaffirmed the way Catholicism had been, that allows for commercial interaction, that says we can treat each other as strangers in a neutral marketplace. We do not have to recognize each other as Christians the way that you had to do in medieval feudal Europe, medieval feudal Catholic Europe, we can now really be strangers. And it is an understanding of Christianity that better conforms to the lived existence of a urban market participant. So all of these are accommodations with the changing conditions of feudalism and final crisis. But then you add the one move, the one push past that has no support within the existing structure and therefore cannot sustain itself as an independent political force. And that is Anabaptism. So one of the chief insights of Luther that gets the whole Reformation going is that he says, hey, you know, you got all these sacraments of the Catholic Church, right? These things that you do for us, this contract, the thing that binds us to you, we go to heaven if we do these things, these 7 sacraments. It's weird. None of them are in the Bible, dude. Bible is the book of God, right? Nothing in here about Eucharist or any of this shit. And all these rites and stuff. Where are you getting this? And of course, where they're getting it is, this is a fucking social technology. It's not in your head. This was created by a pre-literate fucking feudal order. It has to be reinforced by ritual. Duh. But of course, these people now, those rituals are now constraining. They're chains on their neck as they're trying to participate in this rapidly shifting economic order. They don't have a name for it yet. It's not coherent, but it's not the rural rhythm that had facilitated Catholic Europe. So Luther gets rid of a bunch of the sacraments, says these aren't in the Bible, you don't have to do them. Then the Calvinists go a little further and they say, actually, you know what? There's even more. For example, Luther says, fuck all these sacraments except for infant baptism and the Eucharist. I think the Eucharist, that's real stuff. There's a presence, I don't know what you want to call it, I don't think it's transubstantiation, but there's a presence in the Eucharist. It's meaningful. Then Calvin says, fuck you, what are you talking about? It's a cookie, it's wine, get over yourself. But the thing is, well, so they get in an argument, right, about, and that's forms part of the big real conflict between Calvinists and Lutherans that leads to a lot of strife during the Second Reformation, where the Calvinists try to convert the Lutherans and the Lutherans resist, comes down to this question of the Eucharist and of communion. And the Calvinists have on their side the fact that, hey, this isn't in the Bible. But Luther, of course, has his own justification, but at the end of the day, it's motivated reasoning. He wants to keep the Eucharist because it's socially useful. Because in his imagined still feudal order, having a church that dispenses Eucharist is socially, technologically useful. So he can make up whatever reason he wants. That's the real reason that the Eucharist stayed for Luther. Now, the city-based Calvinists who maintain social coercion through the market now more and more than they do through religiously imbued social roles, they say, no, fuck the Eucharist. But infant baptism is also not in the Bible. The same arguments that the Calvinists made about the Eucharist apply to infant baptism, but Calvin didn't touch it. Because infant baptism was the ritual of affirmation of the existing social contract. And when I say existing, I mean not an existing religious understanding of the world, not an existing sectarian understanding, or even geographically fixed understanding, an understanding of oneself in an economic order. As in the one who tills the land, or the one who rides a horse, or the one who counts the coins. The real social structure that animates all of this, that keeps the lights on, that keeps the torches burning. The feudo-capito, early modern social order, where feudalism, as in serfdom, is largely abolished in large sections of Europe in the Holy Roman Empire. Basically, the further west you go, or the further east you go in Europe, the more serfs there are. I mean, Spain is kind of resurfaced in the 1700s because of the currency crisis of the New World silver mines. But like in the center of Europe, large percentages, and in the Low Countries and in England, large percentages of farmers are no longer serfs with feudal ties to the land and feudal obligations. They are tenants or outright yeoman owners. So that is a difference than feudalism, but they're still operating in a system where land-based rights and money surplus is accumulated to owners. And of course, that circulation creates the urban economy, but it's all part of a greater economic order. And infant baptism is your assimilation into that order. Here, you are a member of Christendom, which means that if your dad was a farmer, you're a farmer. You work the land. We do that. We do religion. We do warfare. But you work the fucking land, and in return, you go to heaven. Like, that is the real bargain being struck here. This is the religious bargain. You're going to get protected. You're not going to get killed by raiders. You will be secure, and so you will be able to like get the mere pleasures of life, even as a broken back peasant. And there are pleasures of life in every condition, even if it's just the temporary relief of suffering, and that's enough to get people by. And then there is a greater reward in the hereafter, and that'll keep you farming, which keeps the lords in their castles, and it keeps the city people in their counting houses. So every type of terrestrial order in the hierarchy, from city lords or city burghers, rural aristocrats, and the dynasties above them, all have a vested interest in affirming a basic social order and being able to bring people into it and know that they have that ideological and identity investment in it. Authority is the word I'm looking for. Infant baptism is an affirmation of the authority of the existing power structure, which is still a corporate thing. So no mainstream reformer made the same critique of infant baptism that Luther and Calvin between them had made of all the other ones. Because if you did, they would kill you. In Geneva, they literally drowned the Anabaptists as like an ironic punishment. They drowned them in the fucking river. Because that was the line. Because Protestantism is dissolving social bonds, but only those that are allowed to be sundered. The Lutheran lords allowed him to sever the connection between the church and their lands because it was in their interest. The cities allowed the further severance of connections to landed authority. But nobody is going to cut their own throat like that. And so Anabaptism became a heresy that anywhere you went would get you killed. If you went to the Catholic lands, which obviously, but if you went to Lutheran lands, if you went to a Calvinist city, you were going to get killed if you talked too much about how there's nothing about baptizing infants in the Bible, and you should get to fucking choose to join a community of believers. You should make your own decision as to what order you will obey. Nope. That happens to you at birth. And so the closest thing you see to temporal exercise of power by Anabaptists, those who take Protestantism, the Protestant Reformation, to its logical conclusion of, we're going to bring heaven on earth by living as Christians. These institutions don't allow us to live as Christians. Now, you come to terms with those limits because you're either getting fed, like Luther, or you're getting hanged, like Thomas Munster and the German peasants. Carrot and stick keep you in line along some tension with a state that does not allow Christian living. The Anabaptists, by rejecting the entire social control technology of Christianity, were able to try to actually assert a Christian livelihood on the earth in a major city, which they took over. They were invested by the local archbishop, starved, and then eventually massacred. And of course, what happens when they are laid siege to is very predictably a descent into theocratic madness, mass execution of heretics, also mass sexual licentiousness, polygamy, public sex, Bashian nightmarish revels, because they're being starved. Because the conditions to allow for the material persistence of that community are deprived of them. And so, of course, it descends. And the fact that it descended was used by secular princes and religious ones across Europe to say, this is why you don't do that. This is why there's no Anabaptism. This is why you don't get to pick that. Because you're going to end up mass marrying and fornicating and guaranteeing that you go to hell. But of course, it's only because they were suffocated by the existing powers that be. Just as communism was suffocated by the encircling capital liberals, secular successor to Protestantism that by that point ruled the world. Just as Christian sort of feudal-capitalism ruled early modern Europe. Because both of them sought to live as Christians. Communism, socialism, the dream of it is the dream of a Christian republic. I'm sorry, it is. I don't know if that makes things, but I don't think that's a problem, because a Christian republic is, in my mind, the same as any sort of end state of social tranquility in any other cultural and religious context. It's the same thing. It comes out of a Christian tradition because, as I said, we're locked into the social structures that the previous generations built. History lays like a nightmare on the heads of the living, but we're also building something new. Now, Marx's imagining of how this would go about, that didn't require religion, that said religion would go away, imagined a situation where in the early 20th century, capitalism is overthrown, and humanity, the entirety of it, can build socialism together. Now, of course, that's going to be a violent process. It's going to kill a lot of people. It's going to lead to starvation and misery. But it's going to also build something. And it's going to build people. It's going to build a new human experience, a human subjectivity, a furthering of the process that we saw explode all throughout the development of capitalism. A new human spirit that encompasses humanity and that identifies humanity with God, not the self with God as Protestantism did. Because that is Protestantism. The world can no longer really be God because I'm alienated from it too critically, so I am God. The only two things I know are real: the world as I perceive it and myself. Two things that are not separate, but I imagine as separate. And they're the only things I can believe in. The process of building world communism would give birth to a new human subjectivity that turned God into humanity. And then, of course, into the entire biosphere. And it would be a process of building. And that means that instead of the prolonged deprivation experienced by cut-off attempts to build such a thing, like the premature Anabaptists of Munster and the similarly premature Bolsheviks of the Soviet Union. In those conditions, the social structures that emerge are going to be poisoned at the root because you can't build anything. You are cannibalizing. And that is what the Soviet Union was. Yes, the Soviet Union was a miracle of human endeavor. They built a modern country out of a feudal throwback within a few generations. But it was a cannibalistic effort. They ate their own peasant class. They chewed them up and spit them out. And you can say that had to happen. It did have to happen. But communism shouldn't have done it. Capitalism should have done it, as it did it in Europe, as it was doing it across the world. Now, if you'd had, as Marx and most and Marx and Lenin and Trotsky imagined, if you had a situation after World War I where capitalism was overthrown, there's still so much fucking bounty of the world at that point. There's so much unprocessed, unused energy. There's so much carbon left to be spewed into the atmosphere, right? That all the violence and all the conflict and all the misery that we would have gone through in the 20th century would have still happened, but in a different way, building different institutions, different subjective experiences of those institutions. And gotten to a point where everybody is working towards this thing. Now, maybe you'll never get there because you are living bound by history and by material conditions that might change in a way you can't anticipate, but my God, you can move towards it. And everybody within a social order can imagine that their worth as a person comes from being part of this project. What we got instead, because of the failure of communism, is this suicide, this death drive of the Protestant ego in conditions of scarcity. We are now all in Anabaptist Munster. We are now all in the Soviet Union. We are now being suffocated and surrounded by a capitalism that is all-encompassing and that is no longer territorially based. It has transcended spatial domination and become God. It has become a living God surrounding us. We no longer make history. Instead, all we do is, as the Anabaptists did in Munster and as the Soviets did, try to build something through cannibalism, but only destroying ourselves by cannibalizing. But that process causes a breakdown of institutions. It accumulates contradictions that cannot be accommodated. Because, as I said, no one is working towards annihilation. Everybody wants the world to keep going. I don't really believe that there are any like comic book supervillains who really want the world to end, want to live in a bunker. Like even the ones who imagine, I'm going to go to the moon, or I'm going to go to Mars, or I'm going to go to the bunker. I don't think most of them want that. And even the ones who want to go to Mars, well, I can go to Mars even if the world doesn't end. They don't want the world to end. They're working towards it. We're all working towards it, but we're not doing that consciously. What we're doing is working towards our self-interest as we imagine it. We are worshiping God. We are worshiping ourselves as God. And that practice of worship is to look out for number one in a material way that has the effect of hastening the apocalypse. The unrevealing, but not the unrevealing of our Christian humanity, the unveiling of our damned nature. Not the opening of the pearly gates into heaven, but of the crossing of the river Styx into hell. What that means is that the long-term viability of the social technologies that allow for capitalism to flourish are being undermined. Because we're not just destroying the world, we're also destroying the institutions we're part of in the same way with the same self-interest. Like members of the Democratic Party. The Republican Party, too, they're all digging their own graves. We're all digging our own graves because we don't know what else to do. That's what every generation does. Every crisis empire, every empire that faces a usually climate-based crisis and collapses does so because everybody is going towards what they think God wants. What that looks like is different in every culture, but what God wants is just a reflection of the collective self-interest of this unaggregated humanity that is separated by regimes of domination. The fact that you have surplus creators and surplus enjoyers. You are creating a fractured human community that can only respond schizophrenically to crisis. Because somebody digs and somebody enjoys. Somebody farms and somebody eats. And that creates different worlds, different emotional worlds, different emotional understandings of their self-interest, what the world is, their understandings of God. And so every civilization hastens its own destruction because worshiping that God is just the political and social and economic order you live under. That's the God you're actually animating with your actions. And that social order was built under certain conditions, material conditions. And it doesn't know how to work any other way. If you change the equation in the algorithm, if you change X to Y in terms of inputs, amount of calories basically, it cannot function. But nobody within it can recognize it because they're stuck by it. That is why Marx's Messiah, Marx's second coming, Marx's Mashiach, because remember, he was a Jew and a Christian, both of which are premised on an apocalyptic revelation of a Messiah. For Christians, for Jews, it is an unrealized ideal. For Christians, it's Jesus. For Marx, is the working class. Because what the working class can do, by their self-interests coming into alignment against the system, in conscious conflict with it, you can build a social order, a social mechanism that can take these crisis conditions that undermine the machine and build a new machine. Because it's no longer being oppressed effectively. Because everybody within these institutions is undermining them. Everybody working within every company, every political party in the world right now is destroying their own system. But they don't know they're doing that. They don't know that their self-interest in conditions of declining material, because this thing was built on our selfishness. And when you have unlimited inputs, the machine works. Everybody gets, to the degree they can make a demand of the material world, they can get paid off. So a worker in the dominated colony gets nothing, gets a gun to the head and enough food to keep going. But a worker in the center of the core gets, at the height of this, the lifestyle they see on TV, what rich people live like. Material pleasure and abundance. The only thing I know to be worth seeking, because it's the only thing I am given as a value for that. And of course, the higher up you get, the more they get to demand. The more demands, the demands are met as much as they need to. And then, if they can't afford to be met, those who resist are destroyed. And because they are only resisting individually, they can be isolated and annihilated. It's self-cleaning unit. It is an organism. It is a system of systems. It is immortal until that material condition changes. Under conditions of scarcity, everybody acting in their own best interest in the short term means that all of that social faith that we have in these institutions that keeps us going and that informs our understanding of ourselves and what our self-interests are and how we align them with things like the country or capitalism or America these abstractions that we had connected previously to our own best interest because they were aligned. In the 20th century, this social and political order was built on the premise that the average American citizen would look at the world, look at America, defined as its institutions, its capitalist institutions, and say, we have the same interests, and then act accordingly. But that's because their demands were met. And the people whose demands were not met, they don't know those people. They're divided by class, by geography, by race more than anything. I don't know them. Fuck them. Now, of course, because they've been able to annihilate that disillusionment, alienation that Marx was premising his theory on, and which did rack the world in the early 20th century. World War I to World War II is the second 30 Years' War where you replace Protestantism with socialism. And what emerged from that is this system where capitalism was going to be imposed on people. You're going to take a deal around the world, and everyone is going to get a deal, and everyone is going to take the deal. Or they were going to not take the deal. If they didn't want to take the deal, they would sign up with communism, represented by the Soviet Union, in one way or another. Maybe they were anti, but then, then you have the fact that this is a thing that's fixed in a geographic area and bound by this cannibalistic scarcity. But even with that, you could ally yourself with the Soviet Union, or you could ally yourself with capitalism. Now, of course, in America, there were plenty of socialists who really believed in socialism, but rejected the Soviet Union because it was not democratic. It didn't have all the bells and whistles of a civil society of virtue that I imagined myself living in. And yeah, that's because it was in a crisis condition. It was being strangled by capitalism. But over here in America, where I'm probably doing okay, even if I'm a worker, I'm getting more money than I used to get. And if I'm an intellectual, I'm literally living in a more comfortable, safe, technologically convenient, and interesting world than has ever been imagined by anybody. I can make this distinction and say the Soviets aren't worth supporting. I can afford to. But in the colonial world that was being incorporated into capitalism, after the last old imperial rule was replaced by this new dominion of a abstracted dollar empire of capitalism, as the world system was wound into final form, the same deal was being made. The people who said, I take that deal, are your comprador classes who take power on behalf of capital. And those who say no ally with the Soviet Union and become rebels, fight against capitalism, are largely massacred, or in a few cases are able to win guerrilla wars. And they don't care about the civil society bullshit because their titter is in the fucking ringer. They don't get a corner office or paid vacations. They get a gun to the head and the reimposition of colonial regimes of domination. Unless you're a army officer who gets to hold the gun instead of had it pointed at them, that's a bad deal, which is why you saw this huge rush to communism after World War II in the colonial world. But it was defeated in most of places like Africa and Latin America because there were enough locals who stood to gain in the short term from capitalism to make a deal. Like, that's why Mao said a revolution isn't a dinner party, because, and that's meaningful because for Americans and Western Europeans after World War II, Revolution absolutely was a dinner party because of your relationship to capital, from periphery or center. And that's why I wonder if there was a situation where there was no Soviet Union to align everyone, to polarize workers in Europe and the United States, that maybe that class struggle would have gone differently. Because if you're fighting for socialism in the Western Europe and the United States, and the Soviet Union is what it is, that is going to lead you with a question: do I align with it or against it? And that question is going to be answered by, well, how much do you care about niceties and dinner party stuff? And the working class was divided on that question. It was not aligned. The thing that was supposed to align its goals was the broad push towards socialism. And the creation of the Soviet Union created a fixed understanding of what that meant, which by definition shatters the psyche, the collective psyche of the working class, and separates it into two groups. Now, maybe they all would have been defeated in turn without that material force of Soviet communism to push against fascism emerging. Or the lack of division maintains the focus and the collective effectiveness of these individual working class parties in the individual countries, that they can push in the same direction even though they're not connected internationally. Not saying it could happen. I'm just saying I think that the world we're in is a world where one of those inflection points happened and we failed to transition. We will not see heaven. And in that condition, then you have to look back and say, well, how could we have gone to heaven? And the thing is, at the end of the day, I believe we could have. Because if we collectively could have gone to heaven, that means we all individually can be saved. And I believe that we all individually can be saved. This is where the fusion of politics and philosophy and theology come to me. Is that I believe at the end of more than anything, I believe, and I think the thing that generates true religious feeling, as in religious feeling that expresses a truth, as opposed to the the dark mirrored truth that society reproduces, the truth of human connectedness, the truth of harmony between humans and their environment and each other. That is all premised on the fact that we can all be saved. And so that means things could have been different, which means I have to understand capitalism a certain way. I have to understand that even if capitalism was inevitable, once the Roman Empire fell, because of Europe's specific conditions, its victory did not have to happen. I believe we'll all be saved fundamentally because I do not believe that there is a distinction. There is no our Cartesian duality is the fundamental filter of our individual experiences. That it's the archon. Descartes is Yalboadith, if you want to think about it. He was recognizing the fundamental fracture we have that we have to repair. And that is the work of life, is to repair the breach and to deny that contradiction. That is what working out, in my mind, the dialectic is. The fundamental dialectic is the non-existent distinction between self-perception and the universe. Because we cannot live with that. Living is recognizing it as a distinction, recognizing it as a dialectic. It is delusion. Like, that is what generates conscious life. That is the spark. It's the explosions of like the cosmic furnaces, the creation of stars and nuclear bombs, and every human action is that conflict. We are all, as conscious beings, powered by that push to resolve this contradiction. And then the fact that every time we get to a resolution, we are repelled again. We are always repelled. We feel it, we can sit with it, but we cannot act with it. That is why the idealized religious life is of solitary contemplation. Basically, no acting at all. Whether you're talking about a monk in a Franciscan priory or a monk on a hilltop in Tibet, it is not acting. Because acting on the world requires believing in that distinction, believing in that separateness, and then trying to resolve it, trying to resolve the unresolvable. Fix an equation that can't be fixed, because the remainder is not something that can be expressed in language or symbol. It is a pure feeling. And so the task for all of us who are fallen, who do not have what it is in us to subsist on the meager sensory pleasures of the monastic life, who have to act on the world in order to get our treats. The task is to find a vocabulary of symbols that can stand in for the serenity of actlessness, the serenity of of silence while we act. And that is, getting back to another cliche that I've talked about before and that I hate has been commodified, but it has to be, mindfulness. It is recognizing the contradiction as a contradiction. It is taking the premises only as thought experiments as much as possible, and that requires detaching yourself emotionally from the pursuit of these things. Okay, I went long again. I hope some of this makes sense. I'm sorry if I kept freezing because as I said, I'm stealing internet, but I feel like this was a good one. I feel like we got to some places. I'm once again just trying to, like, the act of me doing this is for me that spiritual act. Because I am a being at the end of history who has been totally alienated from my body and from the truths of my body, the feelings of my body. I live in the abstracted realm of that print culture, and then broadcast, moving image culture, and then of course internet culture is done to me. And so I am addicted to distraction and treats. I am discontented by the void, by the prospect of really living with the ephemerality and non-existence of my individuality. I can only viscerally believe things if I can describe them symbolically. And I would say that is the essence of the abstracted modern psyche, is that it cannot be moved to act, not think, act, absent a formal conscious belief. And this is what Protestantism began, the process of taking religious belief from the realm of the sensory to the realm of the mental, which is to turn it into a word puzzle. And going over that word puzzle allows you to sit or act in any way from a knowledge of truth, as opposed to ignoring it, accepting the reality of the world around you, and acting in exact opposite of your self-interest. Your personal health, your mental health, which is of course the same thing, your treatment of other people, your conscious motivation And so, like for me, a lot of reasons that I did these streams, I did so many of them, is that this was my substitution for that act of sitting, talking something through so that I believe it. And then having the associate good feelings of just sitting here, not doing something unpleasant, not feeling anything unpleasant, because that's the thing. That's why people keep living. The human life in repose is one of more pleasure than pain. Human body in repose, unless there's an active injury to it, and even then you can ignore it, which I do, because my legs all hurt all the time, is one of more sensory pleasure than pain. And we can make it even more pleasure by pursuing pleasure. But pursuing pleasure hurts us, hurts those around us, makes us feel bad. And then we have to sit with that bad feeling. Emotionally, physically, we feel bad and we have to sit with it. And that makes us have to choose to do different things. It motivates us to act differently, to alleviate that. But because we're only trying to get at the surface of why we feel bad, we go in the wrong direction. And so you have to be able to, in the moment of crisis and pain and unpleasantness, remember why you're doing it, which is the greater truth that can be most deeply felt when you are consciously connecting the sensual pleasures of life to this truth. And the sensual pleasure of being in repose is the most pure sort of pleasure, meditation, prayer, because it does not involve you imbibing anything into your own body that makes you feel a certain way. It doesn't involve you selfishly interacting with other people in a way that makes you feel guilty, and that guilt you then have to get away from. And it is, belief is the ability to pursue stillness while acting. And the reason that we're in the death spiral we're in is that the actual Protestants who are left, because obviously, as I hope I will have made clear by now, the premise of what this all means is that we are all Protestants. We are all inheritors of that tradition. We have been bootstrapped by global capitalism into this matrix, but it has evolved over time. Some people now are secular Protestants, but there are still people who have the form of religion, and they believe in God as a real abstract thing, and they believe in heaven as a real place. They believe they'll go there. But that belief is so abstracted from the life they lead and the things they pursue that they're actually connecting it to the opposite of the truth that those things are supposed to represent. Those things are supposed to represent the fact that we are all the same and that we are all in harmony and we can live that way. If you are a Christian who believes in capitalism and the self, which is basically all of them in the Western world, then you believe the opposite. You act the opposite. We are not reconcilable. And Protestantism says this explicitly. We are not reconcilable to God. We are not reconcilable to ourselves and each other. And so we need intervening institutions of authority like the capital market, the compulsion to eat or starve to make us act accordingly. That's why so many Protestants love to say, well, if you didn't believe in God, then what stops me from raping and killing people? It's like, because for you, God is a set of rules to follow to go to heaven and be rewarded, because it is a selfish, individual pursuit of salvation. There is no felt connection to the fellow human being. They are enemies to you. You're as alienated as a Randian, only you have a formal religious gloss and a supernatural imaginary to connect it to. And so that means that you feel bad, but your formal understanding of yourself as a Christian makes you act in accordance with systems that benefit you in one way, allow you to live a decadent lifestyle, but bind you in another, and that make your understanding of, well, what's heaven? What is heaven? I'm imagining heaven. What is it? Well, what is pleasure to me? Pleasure is earthly pleasure. Pleasure is a seafood buffet, a cigar, a trip to Six Flags. Well, those things all on earth depend on surplus abstraction and exploitation. They're built into the package. And you can enjoy them to the degree that you engage in this social contract. So your mind has literally reversed good and evil. You're still pursuing good, and you think it's good, but it is actually evil. And we're all pursuing evil to the degree that we are pursuing our self-interest. Now, like, I'm pursuing my self-interest too. I'm doing evil, but I also try to be conscious of my understanding of religious truth to drive my actions and make me hopefully less evil than other people. If you are a self-conscious like a self-conscious libertarian type, like you are which is a lot of people, you are a homo economicus, you are that last man, or you are a Protestant gloss on that, and you believe in God and the supernatural, but you believe you will be rewarded in heaven with the pleasures of the flesh and not reunion with God, then you will do good in your mind and it will impact your decisions, but it won't stop you from doing the worst thing you could ever do in any situation, because in your mind those things will be the same. Okay. And of course, this is why the only vital monotheistic religion is Islam. Because it was not built, modern understanding of Islam communicated globally, was not created by capitalism. It was dominated from without by capitalism. That's a meaningful distinction. That means that it is a religious faith that is grounded and not abstracted the way that Christianity is. And that means it's vital in a way Christianity can't be. But it is still constrained by capitalism, because people might be operating off of this more vital religious belief, but it is still in a capitalist context. But of course, the problem with Islam is that, as I said, there's nothing within it that really militates against this religious belief being incorporated into capitalism. Like, Islam defeating the West is not the victory for socialism or even like a religious, a theocratic communion of believers. It will be a reconstruction of domination, because Islam was born in domination and validates domination. It has to be transformed by the interaction with working class consciousness, which is the class consciousness of the exploited, the self-consciously exploited, people who understand themselves as the victims of a social order, not the beneficiaries. And that interaction happened within Islam, of course, but it was similarly defeated from without, in their case, by the U.S. government literally undermining secular Arab nationalism that had embedded within it socialist concepts. Was, of course, not socialist always, but like had socialist elements, interacted with the working class, and was defeated in favor of a Wahhabism that emerged from the pre-capitalist, self-consciously subaltern ideology of Islam, when it was the ideology of slave owners and tribal chiefs. And so you have this reactionary religious tradition now interacting with the modern world. That's why the hopeful synthesis for me is like some sort of Islamic-derived monotheism with a apocalyptic horizon, wedded to the thoroughly secularized but still communally conscious Chinese. There's your synthesis. Yeah, actually, never mind all that. Wokeness is a religion. Actually. Yeah, of course, the Shia were tended to be more politically radical because they were a subaltern identity within Islam. And yeah, that's why you have this war between the Chinese state and Islam in China happening right now. But of course, the winner will not be one or the other. That's not how it works. Something will be built from it. Don't know what it'll be, but we're moving in a direction. And then inflection points occur and that direction changes in ways that we can't anticipate because we are bounded by this moment. That's my way of punting the football. But yeah, like that is why I've said this before, why wokeness as a religion is such a slogan of a dullard, because it says nothing. It means nothing. Wokeness is a ritual, an individual ritual of public virtue, which is exactly what Calvinist, urbanized, Christian, self-conscious self-conception of morality is. Duh. Everyone is pursuing that. That's just how it is pursued among a secularized, educated, urban, downwardly mobile, that's the key component, lightly, I guess you'd say, relative to others, exploited sector of the precariat. Not unexploited, but relatively lightly exploited. In that, you feel that the system benefits you enough to be invested in. As opposed to people who are so alienated from the system, they drop out completely. Which is an increasing number of the actual working class in this country, as in the people who feel like they're working. Like their day is, I am laboring for someone else. The ones who feel that the most keenly have the least investment in our civic rituals, care the least about any of this bullshit, which is why they weren't reachable during the Sanders campaign. And that is why wokeness is such a idea fix on the broad liberal left, because it's all they have. It's all we have. Because we are stuck in this machinery of exploitation. And we are going to feel some combination of outrage and guilt about that, and we have to express it somewhere, and we can't express it by acting. We have to express it by thinking, and then expressing those thoughts and validating them by having them ritually reaffirmed and echoed back to us. We need to socially echolocate to find a niche, a place where we can compare ourselves and our virtues to others and say, okay, I'm better than them and I'm worse than them. That means I'm still within the green line and I'm okay. That is how you conduct yourself as a political being absent agency. And that is why wokeness becomes the most dominant register, because it's the only thing that unifies everyone on that side. Everyone who feels more guilt than rage. Forget PMC, any of this bullshit. The real dividing line we're talking about are people who feel more guilt than rage about their current conditions of life. Their actual material conditions. Yes, how they think the world is around them, but that is only a reflection of their real feelings, which are connected to their actual lives. The bad feelings they feel, do they feel more guilt or more rage? That is the real dividing line. If you feel more guilt than rage, you are on, broadly, the liberal left. You could be a socialist, but you don't have to be a socialist. But you are everyone on the broad left, which is what the post-leftists realized is, these people are all the same. And it's like, In the sense that they feel more guilt than rage, yes, they are. But as things get worse, a lot of people who now are on the post-left, they feel worse than they used to feel for a bunch of reasons. And that means they have to put that feeling somewhere. They used to feel more guilt than rage. Now they feel more rage than guilt. And if you want to know why there's the actual populist energy on this country is on the right, like politically organized and not stochastic and relatively uncoordinated, and as a result, less politically effective, is on the right. Because these are people who feel a political rage to the United States. Now, there are plenty of people who feel political rage to the United States that are not on the right. They have rejected both. They don't like Democrats either. They're the radical left. They're the other side of the coin. The people who fought the hardest during the George Floyd protests and got the most violent reply. But they're not part of the project. They're alienated from politics. And then on top of them, you have the people who aren't alienated. And this is what we're really talking about. The people who aren't alienated from politics broadly, as in picking a side and rooting for it and then acting on my preference, those people are guilty. Those people are overwhelmingly people who feel guilty. And that means that they cannot be... Now, some of them feel a lot of misery and feel a lot of rage. Not as much guilt as guilt, but they feel rage and they feel misery and their lives suck. Like, actually suck. Is it not like, oh, it's hell world? Like, I write for a magazine and I have depression, but my day-to-day life is one of ease and pleasure? Like, my day-to-day life is, like, feeling physical pain as my body is taxed for somebody else's profit and I don't get to see it. I am alienated from my time on earth. I am made to feel bad for no good end. For someone else's end, I get to feel like a puppet. Plenty of people of those on the left. But they are the least likely to vote. Because that rage alienates them from a system that they no longer feel beneficial, they can get benefits from. And there are fewer of them in the tent of people who care about politics than there are people who have something to lose and know they have something to lose by the end of the system as they know it. And so that means that while you all might agree in theory that class is more important than race, or maybe you don't believe that because, like I'm saying, this is a coalition. This is liberals too. Because it's a cross-class coalition, you have no agreement on what like a class identity even is. It cannot be organized around because it is a point of rupture. What can be agreed upon by all is the unjust nature of American society vis-a-vis race, intersectional identities. That is the only unifying feature amongst everybody who is politically active towards a left goal, i.e., a place that allows them to feel less misery and less rage, or feel less guilt on behalf of those who suffer it, that I know who suffer it, that I know suffer for my benefit, but that I don't feel myself, which is most people on the political left. One way or the other, they suffer less than they feel the beneficiary of suffering. Now, some people say that's why you're going to see you should be seeing collapsing voting participation, and yet you're actually seeing people vote more and more than they used to. Like more people voted last year than previously. Like there was a big jump across all demographics. And that was what made people so alarmed about Trump, because he gained in all these other demographic groups. He lost among comfortable whites. But he lost so much amongst the comfortable whites in strategic states that it wiped out those gains elsewhere. But those gains were among people who are still alienated from politics, who don't filter things through a political lens, who do not connect a political ideology to their sense of self-worth, which is how I would define politically active people in this country. Like, when you're a member of the left broadly, or you're the right, it's because you self-identify with a political tradition, a political goal. The people who are voting more and more now, I think, are people who don't have that. They have political views, but they are not emotionally held. What they have emotionally held are views about identity, views about who they are in a cultural context, who they are in a demographic context, and most importantly, their aesthetic preferences in the culture war that they are observing and that we're all observing. When you're watching the culture war, you're watching the psyche of middle America's shadow box, and you have the guilty against the pissed, which is the Republicans and the Democrats. And if you're watching it from outside and you have to pick a side, which are deteriorating conditions, and the increased politicization of all culture makes you have to do. Like, if you're a person who, you used to be able to be a person in this country who if you didn't want to hear about politics, you could just decide not to. There was other stuff to do. There was other stuff to watch. You could be apolitical. You can do it now too, still, but it's much harder. It's much more difficult because the people who make culture now are more hysterical about making it than they've ever been before, because they feel more pissed and more guilty than they ever have before, because things are worse than they ever have been, but they're still doing so good, and they feel so weird about that. They either feel mad about their suppressed guilt or they're neurotic because of their recognized guilt. And they get more and more, they want more politics in their culture. They want to be able to reinforce their political identity more by consuming more political content. If they make content, they want it to reflect their political views more. It increases the volume of political discourse, and it spreads its influence over other forms of entertainment, other forms of spectacle. So that you're basically thrusting back on people who have rejected politics already, consciously or subconsciously, politics back to them and forcing them to make a choice. Who are you going to root for? And if you don't have a political commitment to one or the other, you have an aesthetic commitment. What do I like? What makes me feel good? Bunch of weeping Hamilton quoting dorks whipping themselves on one side, or if you're not white, condescending to you on one side, or people just having a good time. People fucking with those other people, because somebody's feeling bad in both of these spectacular imaginaries. But the spectacular imaginary of liberalism broadly, you feel bad. In the spectacular imaginarium of the right, they feel bad, which makes you feel good by comparison. You get to feel good by watching them feel bad. There's no choice. This is an easy choice. If you've not been fully neuroticized by ritually reinscribing the behavior of a neurotic post-Protestant, you would rather feel good than make yourself feel bad. No, they said right-wingers aren't having fun either. No, correct. Nobody's having fun. Everyone's miserable. That's why it keeps getting worse. But there is a spectacle you're involving yourself in that you lie to yourself about. I'm having fun. I'm having fun watching this documentary, the 15th documentary this month I've watched about the Tulsa race riot of 1921, or I'm owning the Chuds online or something. There, at some level, you're doing it because it provides pleasure, but it is a short-term pleasure that is eventually not distinguishable from numbness. But all you can do is that, more of it, and double down on it. So you feel miserable, but you pursue a pleasure. And in the conservative liberal imaginary, it is a pleasure of inflicting pain on another. And in the liberal imaginarium, it's inflicting pain on oneself. What was the big streaming show? What was the big streaming phenomenon of the immediate post-Trump era? As soon as he gets in, The Handmaid's fucking Tale. The Handmaid's Tale, as they say in Pittsburgh. It's the frickin' Handmaid's Tale. Imagining myself martyred, because that's what it is. It's martyrdom, and which is the highest state of the believing Christian. You are pleasurably seeking the inscribement of your own misery. For the entire Trump presidency was the libido unleashed. I have fun. I have a good time. And the fact that you're mad about it makes it even better. That's the real stuff. That's the real juice. Like, Trump's the most miserable man on earth. He has never been happy for a second of his life. He has only had sex, one of like the most intimate, powerful physical pleasures you can have. He has only had sex to procreate, and because he thinks he has to do it to be a man. He's pursued pleasure his entire life and has never found it. But his object of pleasure is himself. It's not somebody else. Somebody else is the object of pain, because that's how we have pleasure. It's a comparison only and always. It's not a thing in itself. That's why so many conservatives go crazy about Kaepernick. Because they only have X amount they want to care about politics. And then they want to care about things like fucking sports. And they don't want to get political feelings about sports. They want to get the pure aesthetic pleasures of sports. And of course, that's built on a political scaffolding, but it's one that they are invisible to. That's what makes it fun. It reinforces their political views without them having to think about it. It's great. Then you make them think about it and make them get riled up. They don't want to feel that. It's still the same like pleasure-seeking cycle, but they're now the aggrieved ones. Because they're, of course, always feeling aggrieved, too. And those guilt-ridden liberals also feel aggrieved all the time. As I said, these are the engines. When I say there's two things, you have to assume that they are within each other, because it is it's a huge group of people, all of them trying to resolve the same contradiction and just popping up on one side or the other of an imagined divide and then pursuing their lives through that. So everyone is aggrieved, everyone is guilty, everyone is trying to assuage one or the other by making themselves feel good and by making other people feel bad. And the thing is as the horizon of like actually materially ameliorative politics goes away, liberals and leftists are increasingly going to have to find their pleasure in the pain of someone else, or else they're going to have to accept their final martyrdom, which they do not want to do. They would love to be martyred symbolically on TV, but they themselves would rather not. Thank you very much. Which is, as I said, the drive of the January 6th penitent is they're going to annihilate me, and in my annihilation, I will be declared an elect. I sacrificed for my beliefs. Or they imagine they will. What they'll probably do is run towards pleasure and away from pain. Because that's the overdriving instinct. Everything else is a fantasy. Because we live spiritually impoverished times, and in moments of crisis, we have nothing to fall back on but self-pleasure in the narrowest sense. So that means all these liberals and leftists are going to accommodate the new order where, formal democracy is dead, any hope of equitable resources is gone. We're going to have to choose people to live and people to die. And most on the left, liberal side, will say, okay, well then if somebody has to die, then make it the conservatives because they have it coming, because they are bad. Of course, this is the same decision that the the conservatives are making. They're saying, yes, point this machine at them because they're bad, because they made it happen. And of course, they're both looking in a mirror. While this is happening, the lower half of both of these coalitions, the people who are more exploited than feel exploited, or the people who are more exploited than feel the beneficiaries of exploitation, the people who are more aggrieved, like genuinely aggrieved, than pseudo-aggrieved, they're falling away. They are being cannibalized. The machine is cannibalizing them, both, while the mechanism, the gimbal, is being pushed by these two sides grabbing for the controls. And I think the final reconciliation of this is a Matthew McConaughey techno-genocidal empire, where we work out all of our culture war kinks until all the really miserable people are dead or enslaved, and the only ones left to care about politics are inside a relative comfortable bubble and have a real physical distance from the suffering that's being created by the system because it's been technologically erased. They're going to only have their spectacle again. All the politics will have been washed out. Everybody who's really suffering will be eliminated and no longer a political subject, no longer even thought of as a political subject or a human being by those inside the circle of wire. And then you're going to have people inside. And all the politics, all of those bygones will be bygones. And all we'll have is our programs and our shows and our spectacle, shorn of all the political content that is now overwhelming it. And what represents that? Matthew motherfucking McConaughey. Pure aesthetic, beauty, charisma, hanging around with a friend. And that friend can tell you, look, it's all right, all right, all right. These people have to die. These people have to be instrumentalized for our benefit. It's not ideal, but it's the best we can hope for. And we all need to accept how things are and respect one another. One another being the people within the wire, because, hey, what's the alternative here? You're going to open the doors? You're not opening the doors. Get real. Not opening the doors. And if that's the only option, and this is where we get to the point where all of our denial can no longer be sustained by the material conditions, we can't have our fake little gunfight, our little pseudo-politics. We can no longer afford that. So if the stakes really are, get with the program or open the doors or fight and then be kicked out or eliminated, let's all watch President... let's watch President... What's a beloved McConaughey character who's not Rust Cole? I can't even think of any because he's him in all of them. Let our beloved, what the fuck is his name in A Time to Kill? Oh, yeah. Yes, there we go. Let our beloved Palmer Joss of Contact tell us like cool facts about Mars that our rover just discovered, and then be like, oh yeah, and by the way, we just nuclear scrubbed North Africa. And of course, this is one path. Because these machines are eating themselves, the termites are chewing from within. These structures that are sustaining this trajectory are being destroyed. They're buckling from within. Something else, by necessity, will emerge from all of us struggling in the wreckage. And what that is, that's going to be a roll of the cosmic dice. It's going to be wild, but we all have to make peace with the fact that none of us will likely ever feel like that moment is happening. We will all only be stuck in our little tunnel trying to deal with the world as it is right in front of us. And hopefully, if enough of us are looking right in front of us and not back in our head, not in our imagined little universe where we're God and the world is separate, if we can act from a more grounded, pre-symbolic faith in our fundamental unity, then we can take this wreckage and build something else out of it. and begin that process of trying to build something. Once again, will it be that actual post-scarcity world? Probably not, but it'll be a thing to move towards. It will be human life with meaning. Okay, I went really long today. I hope some of this made sense.